This is the On Humans podcast with your host Ilari Mäkelä. And welcome to this final installment in the series of the birth of modern prosperity. So far in the series, we have discussed the various changes taking place around 150 years ago that turned, according to all my guests, the course of history. My previous guests have taken different views on what changed, but they all have, for different reasons, thought that this was a change away from historic poverty towards modern health and wealth, and that this happened or became entrenched around the 1870s. Interestingly, this was also the heyday of Karl Marx's own intellectual work. So what would Marx have said if he would have lived to witness the birth and the evolution of modern prosperity? One of the really important parts of modern prosperity was the so-called Great Leveling, the lifting of the working classes from poverty and the creation of a large middle class in pretty much all rich countries. Did it prove Marx wrong? Or was this actually a kind of socialism getting in from the back door in the guise of social democracy? And what does 20th century inequality look like, focusing not just on the rich countries, but rather taking a global perspective? You will hear answers to these and other questions in this episode from one of the leading experts on global inequality today, Branko Milanovic, the author of the really excellent book, literally titled Global Inequality, and also the recent book Visions of Inequality, which really served as the basis of our conversation. You can also find a bunch of relevant graphs with comments by heading to onhumans.substack.com, or you can find a direct link to the article in the show notes. But let's get the show started. So here is Branko Milanovic explaining the world right before the birth of modern prosperity as it was observed by Karl Marx.
Could you describe what kind of a world was Karl Marx living in?
Okay, so I think, Hillary, it's a very good question, because if you look at Marx, he lived from 1818 to 1883. And his main interest was, for the reasons that we know, was England, because it was the most advanced country in the development of capitalism, or actually I would say Great Britain. And that was the time where he had, of course, lots of data, and anybody who has even sort of skimmed through capital knows that there are lots of numbers, there are lots of quotes of government reports and so on. But he did not have the information that we have today, which is a systematic information about real wages, share of capital in total output, and inequality of income and wealth. So what we can now do is actually look at how inequality evolved. And to some extent, he was influenced by that, even if he didn't have the data that we have. And the basic story is that there was a significant increase in income inequality in the UK until probably there were some questions there, whether it was at the very end of the 19th century or it went up to the beginning of the 20th. The wealth inequality, wealth concentration was extraordinarily high, and I think it's probably one of the highest wealth concentrations in modern times.
Yeah, it's a striking graph. I think I saw this in your book of how the wealth concentration in England or the UK, I can't remember, develops. And if I remember right, it starts from like in pre-industrial England, it was like 40%, which is very high. The top 1% had 40% of all wealth. It goes all the way up to 70. But there is the irony that it starts this dramatic decrease right when Marx dies, right?
So then, of course, currently, just to give to the readers an idea, currently is 20%. So we had, during Marx's own time, we have had both an increase in income inequality in England and even more tremendous accumulation and concentration of wealth. So this is the background against which he worked. However, I have to say that also the data on wages do show a consistent increase in real wages. So real wages went up by approximately less than 1% annually. So it is not to be dismissed. But you know what was actually interesting, which we have really to sort of adjust our expectations when we talk about England. England had a very dramatic industrial revolution. It had a huge number of people who were basically chased from land, as you know, with enclosures and the rest. They actually had no option either to work for basically 10 or 12 hours a day, including children. As you know, the child labor was very common, or to become beggars, or to become vagrants, and then to actually end up either in poor houses, being mistreated, or being actually punished and put in jail for not working. And that Marx describes very well. So, when he discusses the position of the poor people, or what he then calls also the reserve army of labor, what he calls the nomadic population, he's really focusing on large groups. This was not marginal groups, large groups that basically had no choice. So, that part of the British industrialization, I mentioned that in the book, just to finish there. Tocqueville, who was a big admirer of British democracy and liberalism, was tasked by the French Academy of Sciences of Cherbourg to go in 1850 to look at the poverty in England. How is it that England, which is so much more advanced economically and politically, has such deep poverty, which France didn't have because the French peasantry was generally, after the revolution, landowning? So, in other words, that peasantry at least had food, wine, enough, stuff to survive and roof over the head. But the English, really, those who were actually chased from land, had basically nothing. And this was this nomadic floating population of which Marx writes quite a lot. And that was, I think, the reality of 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. So that too we have to take into account, even if the formal wage went up by 1% a year.
What do you think then about people who, I've actually even published a small episode with economist Brad DeLong titled "Was Marx Right About History but Wrong About the Future?" I think it's very common for people to suggest this one way or another. We actually didn't focus on income inequality, but let me give you a kind of quick sketch of what many people might say, which is that, look, Marx observes this very dramatic transformation in England, which really doesn't benefit the average person almost at all. It creates this massive accumulation of capital where the richest 1% owns 70% of everything. He's absolutely right in describing this as an unsustainable system. But what he fails to acknowledge is that within that broadly capitalist system, you might have anything like the next 100, 150 years where everybody gets better off, all the boats are lifted, and not only are the workers getting better off materially, but also income inequality and wealth inequality becomes dramatically smaller. And this is something that Marx failed to see, and this kind of disproves the Marxian doctrine that capitalism is doomed to failure. Do you think that's an accurate, would it be a fair rebuttal, or what do you think?
Yeah, let me say there's elements of fairness there, but there are also elements, I think, of misinterpretation. Let me say what I think is correct in that. The description of the wrenching nature of British industrialization is definitely true. It has been confirmed by any people. Marx was, after all, not the only one. You had whole literature in those days writing about it.
I mean, even fiction writers like Dickens.
Yes, of course. I mean, only take Dickens. Actually, I had to read Dickens in elementary school. It was a compulsory reading.
Was this in Yugoslavia?
Yes, and we had maybe I was in the 4th grade or 5th grade. I remember Dickens. I think it was The Bleak House. Actually, honestly, I could not finish the book. The book is so deeply disturbing for a child. It just gave me this horrible feeling of British industrialization, and it was not made up. Okay, so that part I think we all agree, and of course, as Brad Nelsky is an economic historian, that has been substantiated by lots of numbers. Now, when we come to the future, the situation there is, I think, a little bit different. Marx, if you look at Marx claimed to have discovered historical laws of the evolution of human society. But the next formation after capitalism, in his view, would be socialism. That does not mean that socialism came in 1917. That was the claim. But it does. He remains very uncommitted. When would socialism come? So it's actually, there was a sort of a great historical sweep. And he could be right into 2227, Now, where actually he was, I think, wrong is that he could not imagine that capitalism would be able to transform itself in the way that you describe it, in such sustainable and very dramatic way over the last 100 years. I think that he genuinely did not believe in ability of capitalism to actually transform itself to let the state redistribute 30, 40, 50% of GDP. So that's something that I believe it just does not enter.
But hold on, isn't it true that even if you look at pre-tax inequality, it's much less now?
I agree. But that also is transformation of capitalism through greater education and even greater ownership, including obviously housing ownership and even some small financial assets. I think what Marx could not envisage is that capitalism would really redistribute lots of income and would broaden education to the extent that it has broadened. However, even on that, you can actually have a repartee. So the argument has been made that the advent of social democracy, of redistribution, and much greater role of the state was the result of the strength of the socialist movement, threat of the Soviet Union, power of communist parties and other socialist parties linked with trade unions after World War I. So then the situation gets complicated. Maybe that capitalism actually transformed itself because it was afraid of the Marxist revolution. So then it becomes a more complicated story. So had there not been a possibility or significant likelihood of Marxist revolution, maybe capitalism would have continued on this track of the 19th century. So, the situation is not totally clear cut.
I don't want to stay too long on this one point, but I am fascinated because I'm Finnish and I have a lot of respect for the capacity of redistributive policies to create a society which I think is better than it would have been without them. But I'm also fascinated by the cases of some economies like Taiwan, where if you look at the income inequality, let's take some classic thing like the Gini coefficient. You look at Taiwanese Gini coefficient before tax and after tax, and it's pretty much the same. So there really doesn't seem to be government redistribution. And by the way, I think what's more important is the Taiwanese Gini coefficient is very close to the Finnish one. It's very low.
Yeah, Taiwanese actually is very low. I like to use the example of Taiwan because Taiwan redistributes, I think, like 15% of GDP to achieve the same disposable income inequality like Canada, which redistributes 40%. And the reason is that Taiwan starts, the market income inequality is relatively low. So if you actually had very low market income inequality, which means if everybody had more or less similar levels of skills and relatively similar property income, you would actually not need to redistribute that much afterwards.
But isn't this an example of, I agree that it's a really interesting example. It's a very stimulating example. I don't know if it can be replicated. There's something very culturally particular about Taiwan, but I'm wondering just that this could be used, I think, by Marx's harshest critics as an example that you can have a capitalist system which generates a very low level of inequality with a lot of prosperity without government transfers, without any Marxist kind of touch behind it. I'm sure that maybe education would be the answer. There's a government-sponsored education. But what do you think? Do you think that would be the kind of a golden argument in this?
No, there is no golden argument, Larry, because to every argument you have counter-argument. Of course, you can say, yes, that's true for Taiwan, but it's true also because they nationalized Japanese-owned property when Japan left, and that was actually not the only case. I'm from Serbia. Serbia distributed properties which were owned by rich Ottomans at the liberation of the country in 1830, redistributed to peasants. So it became an extremely egalitarian, like Bulgaria as well, extremely egalitarian peasant society. But look, the advantage there. It is easy for you to become extremely egalitarian if you take assets that belong to somebody else and then redistribute that more or less equally to everybody. So it was not totally endogenous capitalist development.
Very interesting.
I don't think history gives us totally unambiguous lessons. Despite all of that, I would say that Marx did not anticipate the role of the state and ability to redistribute both income and education so broadly, and that he was wrong that the socialist economies, in the little that he wrote, because he wrote very little about that socialist economy would be able to function under the centralized system, and that would actually be more efficient than capitalist economies.
One of the major thinkers that you touch upon, who is a kind of theorizer of this era of what's sometimes called the great leveling, so this increased prosperity and decreased inequality, is Kuznets, right? And maybe you could introduce quickly, what's the Kuznets hypothesis?
The Kuznets hypothesis, and I will introduce also the background like we did for Marx. The Kuznets hypothesis is that income inequality goes up under the influence of technological change, or it was in this case industrialization, where what happens, and implicitly Kuznets, I think, had in mind basically New England, where you have equal distribution of land assets, and then you actually have people who get attracted to go to the cities, to work in the cities for a wage. Now, that wage is higher than what you can make, staying in the countryside. So it pulls people out. Then on top of that, it actually has many greater variety of jobs. So as you notice, there are two forces which push inequality up. One force is that people move towards the higher wage, and thereby they create a wedge between them and everybody else who stayed, in the countryside. Secondly, when they move to the city like New York or Baltimore or Philadelphia, they have a greater variety of occupations, so wage inequality or income inequality there rises. So that was his idea for the upswing. And the idea for the downswing was there will be greater amount of capital. Consequently, there will be the decline in the rate of profit. And then on top of that, the population would get older. There will be greater demand for social transfers, and social policies would be directed towards the reduction of inequality. So he charts a very nice inverted U shape where actually development itself kind of leads to the decline of inequality. First leads to an increase and then to a decline.
And he was writing in the 60s, 70s in the US, right?
No, it's actually interesting. He was writing even in the 50s. And what I want to actually put Kuznets, like we did for Marx, in the context. And that also is very striking. With his worst, he was starting working on income inequality in the US even in the late 40s. But the most famous article and then book was in the mid 50s. So think of the late 40s, mid 50s in the US in three levels. First, it was the richest and most powerful country in the world. In 52, US was producing 40% of global GDP. It is currently under 20%. So it was producing really like almost half of global GDP. Secondly, it was the country with the highest standard of living, which continued rising. I think after the recession of 1937, it just kept on going. And during the war, it increased even very substantially. And then third, it was a country, very interestingly, that had a decline of inequality, so much so that Arthur Burns, who was the founder of the National Bureau of Economic Research, writes to Kuznets saying, look, like in last 10 years, we have sort of traversed 1/3 of the road from inequality that we had, which means if we continue like that, we would be practically an almost equal society.
Which during a Cold War era, of course, is very nice to hear for an American.
It was very nice, of course, to say we are really reducing inequality, we have an increase in social mobility. Now, when you say Kuznets, and not you, but I say it also, Kuznets had an optimistic view of income, of the evolution of income inequality. And if you compare the framework of Marx in 1860 to Kuznets in 1950, Marx operates under entirely different conditions that we were just talking about.
So depressing, you couldn't read it in middle school.
I couldn't read the book, So the fact that I'm not saying that we would explain different economists' views simply by the environment in which they work. It's much more complex than that. But there is no doubt that environment under which we live and work does influence our view of the world simply because we try to make sense of it.
On Kuznets, nowadays it's very common to say that he was proven wrong by history, just as it's common to say that Marx was proven wrong by history. See, why would people say that?
It's for the following reason. They take Kuznets' hypothesis. It was defined in 1955, as I explained, so there is no need to repeat. Inequality goes up, goes down. And they say, oh, look, but advanced societies in the US, UK, most of Europe, and so forth, since 1980 have an increase. There is no doubt that there was an increase. So if there is an increase of that, then Kuznets' curve goes up, then goes down, then goes up again. And then they say, okay, well, this was wrong. But I think the reasonable interpretation of Kuznets could be that he saw the industrial transformation in the US, but he did not think of the new transformation that happened in the 80s with introduction of really labor-saving machines, with obviously globalization, with robotics. That was, you can actually argue, this is a new industrial revolution, which also pushes inequality up because there is an upswing where essentially large rents are being realized and kept. And then we would have to wait for political forces or for the redistribution of these rents to drive inequality down. So I don't think we can easily reject Kuznets simply based on the fact that he just described one segment. We could actually apply the same logic that he had to the other segment where you have another industrial revolution.
So okay, now we're on a new upswing. The US and other rich countries are transforming again, and therefore you again have a big wage gap between those that are benefiting from the transformation. But how optimistic are you that there will be a kind of natural downward sloping curve again?
Well, I actually see, now obviously we should not really overdo that, but we basically see since after the financial crisis, so it's essentially since 2008, we see US inequality not rising anymore. We see 1 year up and another year down, and UK is actually on the decline. So I would argue that we have already started possibly the downswing on the second Kuznets wave.
Yeah, there are many people who would hope that you are right in the rather optimistic view about this. There are people who, like Thomas Piketty, who would say that that is certainly not the natural next phase. I mean, if I understand Piketty's argument right, he would say that Kuznets actually misses the point, which is that there's nothing predetermined about this growth spurt, first increasing but then decreasing inequality. Rather, it was just a very unique historical setting with 2 world wars that destroy a lot of the property of the rich people, a lot of the capital, together with social democracy, which was driven by the Cold War need to create an alternative to socialism. This was a very unique moment, and if you look, and we don't need to go into the laws, but just for listeners, I think like Piketty's basic idea is that if you look at certain kind of very fundamental laws in capitalism, they are bound to increase inequality kind of almost forever without this kind of external events that we experienced in the early 20th century. So where do you disagree with Piketty?
No, first of all, I liked very much the book, and I don't have a very strong disagreement. I actually the essential question that one has to ask oneself is: are there sort of internal, inherent forces within capitalism that would actually lead capitalists to reduce inequality? The forces of war are not obviously the inherent forces, because really it's basically an exogenous force.
And we probably don't want to use that method to decrease inequality.
No, and we don't want to use that method, exactly. Then the question is actually, is policy that? And policy in principle could be, and as I said, it was used by Cousins. It's also used by Piketty, because Piketty and Say's main argument is essentially, let's use policy, meaning taxation in particular case, to actually stop this natural tendency of capitalism to produce ever higher inequality. But one has also to admit that there could be endogenous forces, and I meant actual, one which was present even in Marx, and that was the decline in the rate of profit over a long time, and that could actually also mean, it doesn't necessarily mean, but it could also mean the reduction in the share of total GDP which belongs to capital. So in the capital share. So that would be an endogenous force. Another endogenous force could be greater ownership of capital assets. That also is possible. As people become richer, they they invest and have more assets. And of course, Daniel Waldstrom he has a book now arguing that the middle class in Western countries, in terms of wealth, became much better off, in part because of pensions.
Do I understand the logic right that Piketty is worried that basically capital owners have more rapid growth of income than wage earners?
Yes.
But you're saying that, well, there's two ways to counteract that. One is if they don't have that much of a return, which could happen when you have a diminishing return on capital, or if we get more and more people to own capital via things like pension funds, or people just deciding to invest their savings. Of course, they need to have some savings to invest first.
Right. And as I was saying, okay, then we have a policy, and that's why Piketty and Say's and Zuckman insist so much on policy, which is also interesting, because if policy is a tool, that means that the policy tools are not being entirely controlled by capital owners. So that becomes also interesting, because when we criticize capitalism, we often say that it is a plutocracy, because the tools of inequality reduction are controlled by capitalists who would never allow us to tax their capital. But if they believe that actually it is possible to do that, then implicitly capital owners are not sufficiently powerful to stop us from doing it.
What about global inequality? So I think I mentioned to you before the interview that I was recently writing a grant proposal where I just casually said that with the rising inequalities, local and global.
Yes, you did, bro. Yeah.
I did not check the data. Then I did check the data, reading your book, and it's quite striking actually. It depends a little bit on what metrics we look at, but
yeah, sure.
Is it roughly right to say that there's almost a opposite pattern, that if within rich countries inequality has been going down until the 60s, 70s, and then going up again, up a lot in the US, not much up in some other Western countries or Japan, but anyway, up a little bit. But on the other hand, the global inequality looks very different. So it's increasing pretty much until the 80s. And during the recent wave of globalization, whatever demerits globalization has had, there has been a reduction in global inequality by most standards. Am I right?
Yes, I mean, this is such a complicated topic. We already had one very complex topic. We could move to another one. I agree with you. If you just superimpose two graphs, one global inequality and superimpose to that the US inequality, you really have exactly almost the opposite move. In the latter part of the first part of the 20th century, and in the rest of you have the decline of the US inequality, you have increase in global inequality, then global inequality starts going down with China, essentially from 1980s, and US inequality shoots up.
Is it just China? If you take China away from the picture, is there any more?
That's the big question. If you take China out, you still have a decline in global inequality.
Okay.
So that's a very important point. China is crucial. It drives that inequality down most significantly because, of course, it was a very poor country that became much less poor and pulled up 1.4 billion people. And then, of course, as they move through the distribution from poverty to sort of moderate prosperity, they reduced inequality. But even if you take China out, you still have it. If you take India out, then you don't have it.
Wait, China and India out?
Yes, but you cannot kind of say, well, China and India is 3 billion people, but I'm going to take them out of calculation.
Yeah.
So, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
However, it makes sense in the following way, that some people, and I think there is some truth to that as well, they say, yes, there is a global convergence, a global reduction of inequality, but not all parts of the world have converged. In other words, uh, technically, ideally, you would love to see the world converging, whereby all parts of the world and practically most countries and all countries become more similar to each other and more similar to the rich West. Well, that has not happened in Africa, and it has barely happened in Latin America. So the convergence of the world, they say, and I think it's true technically, is a story basically of Asia catching up to the rich world, and very large countries in Asia being obviously China and India.
You have a book called Capitalism Alone, where you chart the development of capitalism, suggesting, if I may summarize it, that there are no viable alternatives to capitalism at the moment. There are different versions of capitalism: social, democratic, liberal, etc. State capitalism is China, etc. Now, I do think I don't know many people who would want to go back to Soviet Union economics. I don't know many people who want to go back to Maoist economics. But I do think that it's very striking how little Yugoslavia is discussed. And Yugoslavia is one of these examples where it isn't quite as painfully obvious that communism failed. You had less state intervention, you had worker ownership, you had small entrepreneurship was allowed, but when it was a bigger factory, the workers had the right to make decisions, etc. I mean, it on the very superficial level, it looks like this might have been a much nicer thing. And they had a lot of growth, right? Similar growth rates as Italy for a lot of the time after the Second World War. Yeah. So you're perhaps the person who most want to ask this question. Is Yugoslavia in some kind of honed version a reasonable challenge to capitalism?
Well, okay, it's a very difficult question. The collapse of the Yugoslav example in people's perception comes largely from the breakup of Yugoslavia from the war. But if you go back and look at how the system functioned, it had certainly some features which are even being replicated, and there are attempts to replicate them in developed countries, which means much greater role in decision making by workers. Introduction, as Germany had it with co-determination, introduction of workers in decision making. So Yugoslavia did have that, and when people have actually lived there, I know that it did actually function. In smaller socially owned enterprises, it functioned more or less as it was supposed to be on paper. In larger enterprises, there it didn't function exactly the way it should have. However, there were always, how should I say, democratic tensions. So it is really not true that there was no sort of democratic decision making. However, there are other problems which exist in the Yugoslav model without going through all of them. One of them being that when workers had much greater say, they also tended to privilege themselves. So, for example, if company invests and I'm about to retire and you're a young worker, and we have an extra 100 dinars to invest, I, as a worker who is going to retire, have no incentive in investing into that company because I'm retiring. I have no share to take out of the company.
Oh, interesting. So if the level of investment smaller, people just take it to their pockets.
Yes. People wanted actually very often to invest less than in a corresponding capitalist company, because for workers, particularly workers who are older or workers who are actually planning to leave, there is nothing to gain from that. For you, maybe you're a young worker and maybe there'll be a better investment and eventually you would recoup that through your wage. But for me, as an older worker going to pension, whether that company would become efficient or not efficient is a matter of indifference. So there were actually several, I will not go over through this, even they have their own names, but there were several technical issues. And if you look at the cooperatives in the West, particularly in northern Italy and Mondragon, they also had the same problem. and then they eventually ended up by introducing limited shares, and actually very paradoxically introduced a worker force that did not have the same right as the original worker. So there are many issues. As I said, one should not dismiss that model as it has certain democratic advantages. But there are genuine, legitimate problems that have been noticed not only in Yugoslav case, but in kibbutz case, in Mondragon, in cooperatives in the U.S. and employee stock ownership plans. So really, one has to think more creatively about how to solve them.
Okay, so that was the final episode in this mini-series on the birth of modern prosperity. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you haven't listened to, you can also listen to my previous episodes with economic historians Daron Acemoglu, Brad DeLong, and Ored Galor. And you can also read my comments with some analysis and highlights from the conversations at onhumans.substack.com. So this has been something a little bit different for a few weeks, recycling of old material, but expect some new stuff coming up very soon, returning to the questions around the life ways of our hunter-gatherer ancestors. I hope that you tune into that next time. Until then, take care.